די, שיגעתם אותי. כבר אי אפשר ללכת ברחוב בלי שמישהו שואל אותך שאלה על בינה מלאכותית. מה הבעיה? שכולם מדברים על בינה מלאכותית, אתה שומע על זה בעיתונים כל הזמן, אבל אנחנו לא באמת מבינים עד הסוף. מי שעוקב אחרי החדשות רואה שיש GPT ויש קלוד ויש ג'ימיני ועכשיו יש מודל חדש, O1, ועכשיו יש מודל חדש שקוראים לו O3, ואולי הוא יפתור לנו את כל הבעיות. אבל מסתבר שיש בעיה פילוסופית הרבה יותר עמוקה. המדען הראשי של OpenAI, החברה שהביאה את ChatGPT, המדען הראשי לשעבר, איליה סוצקבר, שעזב, נותן הרצאה לפני שבועיים ואומר, תקשיבו טוב, יש פה שני דברים כדי שהמודלים האלה יהיו טובים. הדבר הראשון זה כוח חישוב, אלגוריתמים, והדברים האלה הולכים ומשתפרים כל הזמן. אבל הדבר השני זה דאטה. דאטה זה בעצם הדלק שמניע את כל התהליך, ואין לנו מספיק דאטה. אתם יודעים למה? כי יש לנו רק אינטרנט אחד. למעשה המודלים האלה כבר עברו על כל הדאטה שהאנושות הצליחה לייצר, ומכיוון שאין לנו עוד אינטרנט, אנחנו בבעיה, עד שלא נביא דאטה אחר או שנביא איזה רעיון אחר, אנחנו נמצאים באיזשהו פיק שאנחנו לא יכולים לעבור אותו. והסוגיה הזאת היא סוגיה מעניינת, כי מה שרובנו רוצים מהמודלים האלה זה מה שנקרא בספרות Zero Shot Learning. זאת אומרת שהמודלים האלה ידעו לענות לנו תשובות על שאלות שהם מעולם לא ראו קודם, שהם לא יעשו איתנו משחק הזיכרון, אלא שהם יוכלו להשתמש בכל הידע ובכל החוכמה שלהם כדי להסיק מסקנות על דברים שהם מעולם לא ראו. והדבר הזה הוא מאוד מאוד קשה. בשיחה שאתם הולכים לראות, דיברתי עם מייקל פאונד. מייקל פאונד הוא פרופסור שהוא בעצם הפרזנטור של ערוץ Computerphile, שזה ערוץ מדהים לגבי מדעי המחשב ובינה מלאכותית, ודיברנו בדיוק על הנקודה הזאת. מה קורה בעצם יש לנו בעיה מהותית שאנחנו לא יכולים להתגבר עליה עם המודלים האלה, ומה אנחנו יכולים לעשות. בין היתר גם דיברנו על איך ללמוד בינה מלאכותית אם אתם רוצים להיכנס לתחום. מה שמזכיר לי שיש לנו פה קורס מדהים שנקרא בינה מלאכותית. אם אתם רוצים גם יש לכם קוד קופון יוטיוב, אז כנסו, ואם אתם רוצים להבין ולדעת ולהתעסק עם הכלים האלה של הבינה המלאכותית, יש לנו בדיוק קורס בשבילכם. אז חברים, מייקל פאונד. שיחה מרתקת. מייקל פאונד, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. Yes, thanks for having me on.
Yes, it's my privilege and my honor and truly my excitement since you are a celebrity on Computerphile. And we are going to address this as well. But as an Israeli, I must, first ask, have you ever been in Israel?
I haven't, no. It's somewhere I would like to go. I've had family members who've been there and had good experiences.
Okay, not now, but in the upcoming days or month, I think it will be great. Okay, I think that we need actually to start with Computerphile, and in a recent interview, you told David Bumble that your wife find it very, very amusing or stupid that people comes to you on the street and say, hi, I recognize you, but you also get emails that says, listen, you are the reason that I got into the computer science. So how do you see your role as an educator in the Nottingham University where you teach, I don't know, dozens of students, and on Computerphile when you teach actually millions of students?
It's kind of strange, right? Because actually as an academic, even a successful academic will only get thousands of citations, usually, right? And so the numbers on YouTube are so much different that it's kind of hard to grasp the sort of number of people you're reaching compared to. I mean, I teach a course at Nottingham of 300 students, which would be considered a pretty large course.
A huge course.
Still, yeah, my course at Nottingham is sort of 300-ish. But even that is so small compared to what Computerphile does. It's very, very strange. I mean, one thing I think to consider is that, Computerphile started in with Brady from Numberphile reaching out to computer science and starting a channel. I joined it just because it seemed like something interesting to do. There was no agenda, particularly. I don't focus my days around doing Computerphiles. I do them when needed. And so everything that's come from Computerphile has sort of been by accident, right? I just like telling people about computers. I guess as I get more used to it, I am quite passionate, I think, about talking to people about computers. And so it's a really fulfilling role for me that I can reach out. And I try and not go too technical and not go too worrying because, there's a broad audience watching these things on YouTube and you want to try and bring everyone along. Right? You don't I don't need to tell people that I'm very smart. That's not how I work. I don't do that at all. I like to just have a bit of a joke and just talk about some cool topics.
Okay, now I want to nail it in, because 3 months ago, approximately, you upload a video to Computerphile that basically summarized a paper about, zero-shot learning, about the idea of that we cannot use ChatGPT, or we cannot use those giant transformers unless we have massive amount of data, and those amount of data cannot be reached within our lifetime. Now, this is a very technical paper. This is a technical paper. Most people will not read it. Most people will not even come near this paper. The majority will read only the abstract and the conclusion. But your video got almost 1 million views, okay? So the idea of, delivering science in a very precise manner, because you didn't make any discounts when you explained the idea, okay? You didn't make it stupid. You didn't make it, to the layman. You didn't use equations, but what you're doing right now is, I think, profoundly important, not for students, for the entire community. It's not just computer science students that listen to your great videos.
Well, that's very kind. I mean, I think I struggle to believe that, but I will take your word for it. I think that, that video, it's on a hot topic, so it gets a lot of views, and not all of my videos do that well, although they usually do pretty well. I was pleased with that video because it was something that's kind of, we can perhaps talk about that later, but it's something a bit close to my heart, because I work in applied AI and I see these models coming along, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. And that's not the narrative that the media spins. It's not the narrative that the big tech companies spin. And so I think one of my roles is to try and just bring us all back down to the ground a little bit and talk about what actually happens when you're doing AI research day to day, right? Does everything just come along and ChatGPT does it, or does it not? And then you have to find some other clever way of doing things. And so, I think that it does have a lot of impact. Sometimes I do videos that are just more for fun. So I did a video on breaking Enigma that went really well. And I was really pleased with that, because I just literally did that because it seemed like something fun to do, right? I was bored. It was a pandemic lockdown. And I thought, well, I'll just code up an Enigma machine and then I'll make a video about it. And that went very well. And if that encourages someone to have a go at writing their own code, and I do, as you say, I do get emails from people who say, thanks very much, I'm now pursuing an undergraduate or a master's course in computer science. That's like the best email I can get, right? Because I feel like I've had an actual impact now on someone's trajectory of their life, right? As opposed to just, well, they watched the video and they thought it was nice.
And for each email that you get, there are probably dozens more emails that weren't sent in the first place. But you actually influence the lives of many people, and it's not just in the trajectory of pursuing computer science career, but also, and this is what I want to focus now, the idea of that ChatGPT is not a black box or a black magic. Because if I treat ChatGPT as black magic, I can get all sorts of assumptions and fears and the singularities near a school approach. And when you actually explain what ChatGPT does, it first, it take much of the magic of ChatGPT and then say, okay, so it's not really an intelligence. I think it's very important, to understand what this AI means, because from my perspective, the layman has like two notions of AI. AI can mean the Neo from the Matrix thing. The Matrix AI, I'm going to rule the world. But we in the laboratory, basically AI mean import PyTorch, import TensorFlow, okay? Which is vastly different than the Matrix. So how do you see your role in, educating the public as, listen, this is not what you think it is?
I think it's a very important role, and I hope that lots of people will do it. I think the thing that frustrates me a little bit about the whole AI deep learning era is that there is a lot of hype, but also you might see it yourself, in the computer vision publications, which is where I would typically read and publish work, it becomes very much a kind of, well, we'll make a quick change and we'll get some better results, we'll put a paper out, and then we'll make another change, we'll get some results, we'll put a paper out. There's no long-term thinking, Right? And there are some researchers, sure, doing long-term thinking. I'm not disparaging the entire area, but a lot of the papers are very, very quick, get it out. Within 6 months, something else has beaten it and we will never look at it again, kind of thing, right? When I was a PhD student, which, you know, was quite a long time ago now, the papers were sort of, you know, they went for 5-10 years, the papers that people used, right? And so I think that things move very quickly and everyone's very overexcited. And so you end up with this kind of hyper, this is going to solve all these problems. Let's just throw it at a load of problems and look at how well it does. And I like to take a step back and do, okay, let's do some scientific experiments. Let's work out actually whether it does those things and how well it does those things. In terms of the sort of the media and the tech companies, I mean, I think the thing to remember, and I think the thing that people forget, is that these tech companies have a massive vested interest in us buying into their products. Right? And so even if those products are as good as they say they are, we have to bear in mind that everything they say is a kind of PR spin, the best possible version of this product. Because no company puts out, our product's not very good, we don't actually like it. Like, no company says this. And so, you know, I think that that's something that often gets lost, right? A company will put out, like, we'll release a new version of whatever product, and it's way better than the previous one. And no one will ever say, can you show us some metrics that show that it is? Does it actually work in conversation any better? Is it more useful for me? They won't ask those questions. They'll go, oh, this is really shiny, and they'll put out a blog on it or a news article. And they won't question it quite as intensely as they should. And I think that's something that, in my very small way, I'm trying to just steer us a little bit away from, because I don't think it's particularly healthy to do this. It also scares people, right, quite easily. So, I mean, you know, people mostly see me on the internet, but actually, obviously, I just have a regular family and I do normal family things most of the time, just like everyone else. And I have the same conversations with my family as everyone else does with their families. So stuff like lots of people ask me about whether AI is going to take over, is it going to affect all our jobs and stuff? And mostly these questions are because people don't know what it is, but they've been told it's going to be scary. Right? And so I think that if I can try and answer some of those questions, that's going to be a really helpful thing to do.
You know, what you just told me about, you know, papers that after 6 months is going to be irrelevant. This is so true. I had a talk with Mark Bishop, and I had a talk with other researchers as well in other disciplines like Richard Nisbet and Danny Kahneman and others. And they told me the exact same thing over and over again. In older times, and it was Bjorn Strustrup, the inventor of C++, in older times, you published once a year, okay? And this is why when you read old papers, so you see the name and then the year, okay? McCarbridge 1981, that's it. This was published. And the inflation of academic works, you know, I think diminished the importance of each paper, and we can't think, you know, for the longer term. And you are so right about it. So I want to ask you where you stand in the Yann LeCun, Jeff Hinton debate. Okay, so let me introduce the debate. Jeff Hinton in a recent Cambridge lecture said basically those LLMs can think. The idea of embedding, okay, is exactly what we think, what we say or we mean as human beings when we think, okay? This is not an autocomplete, a very simple autocomplete. It's not fish and the higher probability is going to be chips. It's going to be something profoundly different. This is the Jeff Hinton school. Basically, those things, and hallucination is basically like what we do when we don't forget or when we don't remember or forget not exact what happened. And the Yann LeCun approach is, this is profoundly different. Guys, we need embodiment. We need sensor. We cannot rely on ChatGPT as LLM. And therefore, like Ken Stanley said, the leap between GPT-4 and GPT-5 will be much smaller than the leap between GPT 3.5 and GPT-4. So where do you stand in this giant debate?
It is an interesting debate to watch. I don't tend to inject myself into that debate. I suppose broadly speaking, I'm on the Yann LeCun side, right? So broadly speaking, I don't agree with Yann LeCun on everything, right? Particularly the role of meta. But the broad argument I think for me is if you're going to tell me that this thing thinks, if you're going to tell me that this thing is doing what we're doing, you need to provide me some kind of basis in science to prove this to me, right? Rather than metrics, which I don't think, you know, doing a maths Olympiad that you've been trained on, I don't think is an interesting thing to do, right? I mean, it's interesting in the sense that it's then a tool that will do that function, right? That's an applied area, fine. But I don't think that shows me that it's doing what a person does. And also, I don't know what a person does, right? And I'm not convinced that Geoffrey Hinton knows either, right? And we barely understand, and this is not to disparage neuroscientists, which is an incredibly impressive and difficult field. We barely understand what the brain does and how it does what it does. Right? And so I think if we totally understood the brain and we totally understood what a large language model does, we might be able to be in a good position to compare the two. But we understand neither of those things. And so I don't really understand how we can have a conversation that says it thinks or it doesn't. All I would say is that so I'm going off what I see every day, and I suppose I don't think it does what I can do, right? Or indeed what a small pet can do, right? In terms of the way that it can generalize, the way that it can learn, the way that it can apply to task A something on task B, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that given that I don't understand really what an LLM does in the kind of, because I'm not in the weights, you know, it's too big to understand, and I don't understand how a brain works, based purely on the output, I don't think we're there, right? And I'm not seeing much evidence that we have this kind of massive growth. I mean, that paper you were talking about earlier was talking about which direction are we going, and I haven't seen any particular evidence that we're going up and up and up, right? You know, you'll notice this is also to do with the media hype, but you notice that when ChatGPT 4.0 or 4.0 came out, it was noted, right, in the media, but no one was jumping up and down like they were when it first came out, right? Because people are kind of used to these products now, and it doesn't do anything that's totally transformative compared to what it did before, and it's starting to level off, right? So I think that there's a pretty credible argument that says we're nearly at a peak of what LLMs will do until we come up with some new way of measuring it. So maybe Yann LeCun is right. So embodiment, you know, sensors, some symbolic AI, you know, some other strategy. Right?
This is exactly what Ken Stanley told me. I think we are reaching the peak of what transformers can do. Now, I want to just recap or explain or give just one example about how different what the brain does and what LLM does, okay? So I'm going to give the example, and please tell me if you agree with this example. The idea of classification, downstream task like dog versus cat classification, okay? Which ChatGPT, I don't know, which transformers or neural network can achieve brilliant results, great results, great results. Everything's, you know, 2012 in the ImageNet, in the AlexNet, great, but we need thousands or even tens of thousands of pictures as a training data in order to distinguish cats from dog. Basically, a toddler, even a baby, can distinguish that based on a very, very small amount of data, which means that I don't know what the baby's brain does, but I know for sure that it does something different than LLM because it doesn't need so many examples. So would that be a good example of how our brains differ?
I think you can also extrapolate much better as a human. So if I give you an example, suppose you have a child who's not been introduced to as many animals as you have, and you explain to them the concept of a horse, right? And you show them a picture of a horse, and then you explain to them the concept of a pony, right? But you don't show them a picture of it. You just say, okay, a pony, it's a smaller horse. It's got a thicker body compared to its leg size. Its mane is maybe more bushy, what have you. They could then draw a pretty good picture of a pony, having never seen one, by just taking a horse and changing its features in their mind into a way. Now, an LLM will do that to a very, very limited extent, but not anywhere near the level of a person, right? It would be ridiculous, I think, to claim that it would. And it's this kind of taking ideas and work and coming up with new ideas and things. I just don't think LLMs do this. And I think also when they do show an incredibly impressive result, that's often simply a side effect of that result happened to be in the training set, right? And there isn't enough testing of this. You know, sometimes papers will look at samples from the testing set or the training set to work out to what extent an LLM is using this as a basis for some prediction or some sentence or something. And it's often much stronger a link than people think. Right? People perhaps assume that we've trained on all this stuff and now it can write about things that it's never seen. That's not the case, basically. Right? It trains on things, it writes about things it's seen. And when you ask it to write about things it hasn't seen, that's when the performance really, really drops, you know.
Okay, so I want to dive into the papers that you just mentioned. And again, there is a great video on Computerphile that we will attach a link in the description below. But basically, we need to understand the idea of zero-shot learning, okay? The zero-shot means basically that we have no previous examples, okay? We are trained in a different way. And there is a very famous data set, cats versus dogs versus pandas, that I give my students in freshman year. And sometimes you get very good results for pandas. And this is why, wow, the algorithm can distinguish pandas or can understand the idea of pandas. But no, the idea is that pandas, when you have pictures of panda, this is usually in the zoo. You know, you don't get pandas walking the street. Okay, so if you have pandas on the zoo, the background will be basically the same over and over and over again. So the pandas picture are very much alike, are much more similar to the cat to dogs picture when they can be basically everywhere. And this is the idea of since I don't have pandas running down the I don't know the street, it's going to be very difficult to extrapolate how panda will look running down the street. So could you please explain the idea of why zero-shot learning is so profoundly important in the context of AI, even not AGI, just AI?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps one thing is to think that the example I was giving about ponies and things is to an extent an example of a kind of zero-shot or a few-shot approach. And so the idea is that, you know, we've been very reliant in deep learning on large data sets, as you mentioned yourself, and even simpler tasks need some amount of data in the order of, let's say, hundreds of examples. Few-shot and zero-shot learning is the idea of learning a concept, having never seen that concept before. Now, in the content, you know, with LLMs, I always think the term zero-shot is a little bit of a misnomer because they have a huge training set where these concepts will be in the training set to an extent. They're just not necessarily explicitly labeled. But the idea is that you maybe have a large model that you've trained at some other time on some other data that's unrelated, and you want it to perform some new task. And because it's very powerful and very general, it can perform reasonably well on that new task. So this would be identifying something like identifying the difference between cats and dogs, despite the fact that I personally have never given it a picture of a cat or given it a picture of a dog. And that's very, very useful because that's a little bit closer to what we do. Right? And so that would allow you to have a network where you could say, well, I've got this network, I'm going to apply it on this task, and it's going to perform very well, as opposed to the normal process, which would be, well, I've got this network, it doesn't work on this task, I've got to go and collect some data, I've got to label the data, I've got to find a doctor to label it all because I don't know what I'm doing, and it takes months and months, and then it only works reasonably well. You've got to go and get some more data, and so on. And so I think that if it worked really well, zero-shot learning would allow you to essentially apply an AI, you know, and by AI, I'm just, you know, a large language model or a convolutional network, some large model to a new task with very, very little effort. And can you hear that? There's someone, someone's drilling somewhere in the building and it's coming through the concrete.
You know, if you hear this sound in Israel right now, these days, it means something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I do. Yeah, it's nice not to be in that situation, I would say, right? I mean, I have quite a comfortable, privileged life. So I think zero-shot is very, very important. I think with respect to large language models, the way that we frame zero-shot will be something along the lines of, a large language model tell you that tell you the content of a picture without you having to provide a bunch of training data to give it clues. Basically, that's kind of the idea.
And again, the idea you gave in the video, you gave an example where I ask a diffusion model like Midjourney to draw a castle. And there are many castles in the training data, and I will get great, beautiful castles. But if I ask to draw something that is very unique, very rare, something that maybe wasn't on the training set at all, I will get not so good results, or even results that can differ from what I originally wanted. And this is basically the idea of learning, the idea of learning is the idea to adapt old skills on new environment, on new scenarios, new situations. This is why there is a term that machine learning algorithms are very good at predicting the past. We need, if I know the distribution, if I know the past distribution, I can extract many, many wisdoms about the past distribution. Therefore, I cannot use basically machine learning to predict the Bitcoin price in the upcoming year, because no one knows what the Bitcoin distribution will look like. We know how the Bitcoin distribution looked like 1 month ago, 1 year ago, etc. Okay, and the premise of the article is that in order to perform zero-shot learning, no matter what, and again, if I want to distinguish cats from dogs, this will be great. But if I want, to a specific kind of a tree, which was not on the training set, I had the trees, not a specific kind of tree. And later on, we will move to your work about plants. Okay, if I want to, I will get not so good results. And the idea of the paper is that no matter what, in order to get much better results, I will need a massive amount of data. And this amount of data cannot be achieved, basically.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps the key insight is this exponential relationship between the amount of data and the performance, right? So if you want to get to okay results, you probably don't need that much data, right, comparatively. And so that might be achievable. But if you want to get to results, consider, actual applications of AI like banking or predicting stock prices, where it's actually important that you get it right. Self-driving cars. These are places where mistakes are really not a great idea. And so we need to get into the high 90s of accuracy, right? Maybe higher. To get to that, I think the paper is suggesting that the amount of data is prohibitive, by which maybe, it cannot be achieved. We don't have that much data on Earth, but it's also profoundly inefficient to try and use just the sheer amount of data to try and brute force our way through this problem. I mean, we don't do this in other fields, right? In cryptography, you don't try and break a modern cipher, by just brute forcing the key. You try and find a smarter way to do it, because brute forcing the key is not possible. Right? And so, not possible in our lifetime, I should say. So it's the same kind of idea, this idea that we can just throw more data at the problem. If we need better performance, not on castles, on ponies, we just need to find a heck of a lot more videos of ponies, right? Well, that's fine. There's a human cost in collecting that data, and there's an environmental cost in training these models. And so we should think about this. And I don't think people are thinking about it yet, because these companies are pushing to try and deliver the next exciting product. But I think we have to start thinking about it. And, a lot of these companies spend a lot of money training, a lot of money actually running these models, and cost is going to become more of a factor, I think.
So basically, the idea, what you're saying right now, and the idea of the paper is we need, like in the cipher example, we don't want to do brute force. Basically, we cannot do brute force. It will be too expensive. It will take too much time. We need a different approach. And a different approach in this context means a different algorithm.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps one of the things that the paper was saying was that there is an assumption, particularly in the computer vision deep learning literature, that the generalization on topics that are outside of a training set has already occurred because the training set is so big. And so the idea would be, well, look, yes, you've shown it lots of castles and cats and dogs, but it will perform really well on these other topics. And actually, this paper challenges that assumption and says that's not the case. But where we see good performance, it's almost universally because there's a lot of data backing it up. And so if you're someone that needs to use an AI to do a very easy problem of which there is a lot of data, it probably already works for you, right? And then that's not a problem. But if you're someone that has, let's say, a specific medical issue that they're trying to solve, or a specific plant issue, like some of my research, it's not going to work straight away. And then you need to think about whether it's a case of collecting 10,000 more images or doing something a bit different, right? Maybe not using zero shot right now.
You know, one of my research is basically using AI for a graphomotor test for children. So the idea, if I get a child and he draws a shape. It could be a very simple shape or even more complex shape. And then I want to give a score to that shape. Now, the idea of the training data, I can distinguish, circles from triangles, from squares very easily. But when you go deeper into the idea of, just a second, how good or how similar this shape to another shape, it is a very different approach. Okay, you still can do it with deep learning and computer vision, but this is another approach. Now, yes, please.
Yeah, well, what I would say in your case is the answer is probably you don't use ChatGPT, right? Because ChatGPT will probably say there's a triangle in this picture, but if you ask it to give you detailed descriptions of two triangles and compare them numerically, it is completely incapable of doing this, and so it's not worth doing, right?
Yes, and what we basically used is the combination of computer vision and deep learning. The idea, and I want with your permission to ask you about this, because in all the books we get, what is the difference between machine learning and deep learning? In machine learning, we need to supply the features. In deep learning, the algorithm should, God's hope, to learn the feature itself. And basically many people say, okay, deep learning can do everything. I just, inject all the data that I want. Deep learning will find the correlation between all the pixels, etc. And the other day I ran a panel led by the Israel Institute of Robotics exactly about this thing. Should we rely in robotics on purely AI or deep learning, or should we also incorporate like more standard classic robotic algorithm? And I want to ask you the very same question about vision, about computer vision. Do we still need to learn computer vision, which means Ransack, half transform, half lines, contours, etc., or we just throw everything to VGG 16 or 19 and it will be fine? How do you see this?
So yeah, I mean, I agree with you, right? But so my PhD was in the early 2000s, so about 2007, and at that time, deep learning was not a thing, right? There were a couple of small networks, but basically, deep learning wasn't a big thing yet, and so we relied on standard computer vision algorithms most of the time. So I still have a sort of, should we say, a firm basis in those algorithms, and I think that one thing we're missing at the moment is that a lot of the PhD researchers, for example, who are driving quite a lot of the work in computer vision and AI, don't know any of these algorithms because they have never been taught them, because they're not seen as important. And so they will solve a problem, or they will attempt to solve a problem with a purely deep learning approach, because that's the one they know, right? They know how to import PyTorch, they know how to throw a big network. And so suppose you have a problem where deep learning will get you 90% of the way there, but actually, if you just incorporated another algorithm from historically, like an edge detector or something like this, you might get to 95 or 99%. They should have done that, but they don't, because they don't know about those algorithms. And so I think that there's sort of two problems. One is the kind of tendency to just use AI for things, and the other is that we don't know what the other alternatives are. I mean, it works both ways, I think. The example I often give if I'm doing a talk on this is I wrote a piece of software to analyze root systems in plants. This was a long time. Yeah, this was a very long time ago. And the problem I had with that was that detecting the tips of the roots, which is kind of core for reconstructing the whole root system, is very, very difficult using image processing, right? Because you're just basically looking at pixels, trying to work out whether they look like a pointy stick, and there are loads of edge cases. There are bits of dirt that look like a root tip, and all this, and you end up spending 6 months writing a load of really specific if statements to try and coerce your way to a solution. Or you run a deep network on it and it does it first time. Right? So I think it can work both ways. Deep learning can be a really good way of getting yourself around 6 months of programming edge cases. But it can also be, if you use it on its own, a tool that is never quite as accurate as you need. And you've got no way of closing that gap unless you can employ other safety mechanisms. I mean, Tesla's a really good example of this. Tesla, for many years, had or at least the way that they spoke about it, they were talking about this fully convolutional network approach to self-driving cars. Right now, my intuition, having not worked on the problem, is that that's very, very difficult to do, because a convolutional network will get you some amount of accuracy, but you need close to 99.9% accuracy to manage a self-driving car. So why not have laser scanners and other hardware-based approaches that are hardwired in? You know, Volvos and other cars will brake if they're going to hit a wall, right? Because of a range detector, and it's hardwired in. So there's no convolutional network that can go, oh no, let's carry on, right? You know, and in fact, when Uber crashed into a woman in their self-driving car test, it was because they disabled that feature on the Volvo that it was in, right? Because it was causing them to stop and start a lot. Well, yeah, because they kept crashing into things. So I think that relying on just deep learning is kind of short-sighted. I mean, we still run courses in image processing here at Nottingham, and I think it's a really strong thing to do. Also, I mean, if you don't understand what an image is and what the pixels are and what they represent, I just find it hard to believe you're going to be able to provide your best work, even on deep learning. That's just my feeling.
Okay, so let me just recap. Let's say that you now need to reprogram RootNav, your root software again. Yep. Would you use deep learning? Because what you just said were two things. One, that deep learning software can easily, replace 6 months of if-then approach in Python. And the other thing is that sometimes, 90% accuracy just by deep learning can be increased to 99% using deep learning and some OpenCV algorithm. So what is the best strategy, to combine them together?
We did this in RootNav too, right? So what we did was we said,
so please share.
Yeah. So we said, look, the deep learning works really well for segmenting the roots. It works really well for removing the noise. It works really well for finding the root tips. But it's totally hopeless at traversing the root system and working out whether this root is a primary root or a lateral root, and whether this root's angled at this direction or this direction. So what we essentially did was we used the deep learning as part of a pipeline where it produced the best segmentation it could, and then we programmatically dealt with that and handled the mistakes. We said, well, okay, look, it's found a root tip where the distance in pixels is totally ludicrous. That must be a mistake, and we would delete it. You know what I mean? So we had we had a lot of tests afterwards to filter and sanitize the output of the deep network to make it more amenable to measurement, is the idea. And that's kind of an approach I like to take in a lot of cases. If the deep network gets you the result you need with no other work, great, right? That's a win. If it doesn't, then be prepared to write some stuff around the sides, but does a little bit more of the heavy lifting in the difficult cases. And I think if you use it smartly as a tool in other processes, I think it can be very, very powerful. I just think it's short-sighted just to use it and then call it a day and go home.
Okay, now last question about this topic. Would you say? I think what you just said is very important. Deep learning should be just a part of the pipeline itself. Okay, so this is very. One needs to bear it in mind. Now, my question is: would you say just by your hunch or intuition that the deep learning should be first on the pipeline and then other algorithms, or the other algorithm like computer vision should be first and then deep learning?
Good
And
question.
again, each problem is a different problem, and one needs to treat each problem accordingly. Blah 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 blah. But
yeah, I guess the way that I would tend to do it is I would assume for the first day that deep learning will probably be able to do the problem at the beginning, right? And then I will see what happens, and then I will experimentally test it. So it might be, we found results where if you change the color space or you pre-compute some features, even the CNN can get better because there is an assumption that they learn these features, but they don't always learn them optimally. And if you have an idea of what's going to be useful, then put that in, right? And do some handcrafting of features, do some pre-processing of the image, and so on. But I wouldn't maybe do them on day one. What I would do is I would just say, okay, let's get a baseline accuracy for a deep network. So I'd say, right, let's run a standard network on this task. Let's see where it works and where it doesn't work. And then if it works, we can go home, right? If it doesn't work, which is most of the time, we can say, right, what can we change on the input and what can we change on the output to try and make this work better? And that's kind of the process I use. So I guess I would do deep learning first, but only as a first test, and then make a decision as to where to go next.
What you just told me, I think is great, because I always tell my students, you can get so much from changing your color space from RGB to HLS or something like this, and wow. And the idea is that reality can be represented in those pixels. Those pixels are not just something that someone drew. Those pixels means something, and if they mean something, one can change from RGB to HLS or something like this. You will get better result because your representation will be much more accurate.
Yeah, and I think there's an assumption that deep learning will learn that representation if it needs it, and that is not the case, right? That is sometimes the case, but you need massive amounts of data, and you're making an assumption that a difficult mathematical function can be found, right? You're doing gradient descent, essentially, and you might get stuck in a minimum that doesn't learn that function. And so, this is one of the reasons why people use intermediate supervision. So intermediate supervision is a term, I don't see it used as much anymore, but people, it's so common. But there was a time when it was quite rare, which was where you have loss functions throughout your network. Right? And so you're doing a segmentation task. Maybe you have a loss function that tries to learn segmentation a third of the way through the network and 2/3 and at the end. And the idea is that having those loss functions at midpoints coerces your network to better learn the function throughout the whole network rather than just sort of getting it over the line at the end. And you might get a small performance benefit. And so actually, I think that one thing you can do is you can add different objective functions, you can add loss functions, you can add branches to your network that learn a different auxiliary task and so on. And this is often another way of looking at it. Right. So I think that, yeah, I'm a big fan of finding out what the best representation is of your data and finding out how best to ask the question of the network rather than just assume that input loss function is what's required.
And again, deep learning, we might say that mathematically deep learning can do the conversion between one color space to another color space, but in reality, why? Yeah. Why should I let deep learning do it if I can do it myself? Okay, and if the deep learning can do it, maybe it will take so much data, so much time that it's not worth the effort. Now, I want to go over to your Google Scholar page, and in your Google Scholar page, you have many papers about combining AI, machine learning, deep learning with plants, okay? And one of your in RootNav was published in plant physiology and biotechnology and bioinformatics. So many of your work in applied AI, that basically means that you took great algorithm from the discipline, from the realm of computer science, and implemented them in another very distinct field, which is called plants. So if you could please,
biosciences,
yes. So if you could please tell me something about the beginning of or the origins of this research, how this research came into existence.
So when I finished my PhD, which was about 2010, 2011, I did a couple of different postdoctoral roles. So for those people that are not academics, you would typically finish your PhD, and if you want to stay in academia, you would do postdoctoral research roles on projects at different institutions, and then maybe one day you get given a permanent position at an institution. And some of my initial roles were in a large platform grant, which is one of the sort of premier grants you can get in the UK, that some of the professors at Nottingham had received. And the idea is that basically this platform grant was called the Centre for Integrative Plant Biology, or Plant Integrative Biology, I think, actually. And it was essentially a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary grant that had, you know, physicists, mathematicians, bioscientists, computer scientists, all working with a kind of common goal of better understanding plants, but also improving, you know, plant yields, resistance to disease, drought tolerance, you know, important global challenges. And so often the work was driven by plant scientists who had a specific thing they wanted to understand better. So they have 10,000 plants and they want to know which are the ones that are best suited to a drought soil. So they grow them all, they don't water them, and they look at the ones that are the most healthy, right? That's my very gross oversimplification of their research. And my role was as essentially adding computer vision into this. So plant phenotyping is the idea of measuring plants that we can then link back to the genetics and go, okay, this genetic difference has led to this appearance and structural change in the plant, which means it's better suited for water or it's better suited for sunlight.
Basically, the transformation from the genotype to the phenotype, from exactly. The genotype, which means the genes, to the phenotypes, which means what do the genes represent? What exactly. Does the gene represent? And
so typically, you know, 20 or 30 years ago, this would have been done mostly by hand. So you would literally have 10,000 plants and you would have a field of researchers going out and measuring these plants with a ruler. And it would take months and months. And then it doesn't work because you've got the wrong plants. You've got to do the whole thing again. And the process is incredibly slow. And the problem we have, I guess, is that plants are incredibly important for things like food, right? And we don't really have the time, given things like climate change and global population growth, to spend years and years and years getting 1% increase in yield. We need 1% increase in yield this year and the next year and the next year. And so if we can automate this process, it takes that away from the bioscientists who can focus on what they know and what they're good at, right? And so my role was essentially to try and speed this process up. Now, I started by doing this as a postdoctoral researcher. I actually got really into the field. I quite like biology as it happens. And what I find really rewarding is when people, you know, actually are seeing benefits from something you did, right? So, you know, a bit like we were talking earlier about how some papers can be kind of temporary because of the kind of rapid pace of AI. That's less the case in an applied area like biosciences, because ultimately, if you produce a tool like RootNav that works for what they need, people will use it for years, right? And it's still in use, even though there are probably better algorithms you could produce, people still find it useful. And that's very rewarding, right? And it gets you good impact. So I work on lots of different fields now. I'm kind of broad. So I work a lot with engineers on microscopy, and I work with bioscientists still on plants. But my kind of core area is applying computer vision to someone else's problem. And I think the reason I find that really rewarding is because of that impact it has. And also I learn a load of cool stuff about other fields as well. Right? I'm not living just in my office talking only about computers. I learn about biology, I learn about engineering and optics and lenses. I learn about medical imaging. You know, I find it very fulfilling to learn about all these things as well.
I want to raise two things. One is I just stand in awe, in amazement. I don't have other adjectives, but you can come up with other adjectives as well, about the power of taking one tool from one discipline and applying it in another discipline. And sometimes, you know, very simple tools in our discipline, very simple tools like, you know, edge detection can create huge impact in other disciplines where they are unfamiliar with those very tools. So just the idea of basically the interconnectivity between, or what you said is in a multidisciplinary things, this is a very powerful idea. This is one thing that I want to, if you can relate to. And the other thing is what you just said, that you, during the process, you learn biology, because you are not being brought to this research just as an AI expert. In order to become more efficient, you must also understand the topics that you are into. You can't just, okay, this is my tool and this is convolutional neural network. Let me just smash my hammer on every problem that you get. So if you can please elaborate on those two, the importance of knowing the fields that you're trying to apply your algorithm to.
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps this also ties into kind of a general vibe that you get from computer vision, which is that applications are not as interesting, right? So the core computer vision research community, and I don't speak for everyone, right, but would argue in the general case, I think, that if you apply on a very specific problem, that's less interesting than if you apply to lots of different problems. And so you do see less applied research, at least in mainstream vision conferences. Now, I think that's a great shame because it's hugely impactful and very, very interesting. And the other thing is that there's an assumption, perhaps, because AI is now kind of ubiquitous, right? We see it a lot in lots of different tools, that everyone can use it for whatever they need. So why would we do it? Why would I do plant biology when the plant biologists can do plant biology? And the answer is that they're not experts in AI.
This is great. This is, wow. You just nailed it. You just nailed it because, again, you can't send your papers in applied computer vision to those conferences because what you just said now just nailed the point for me.
Yeah, and so it's, I mean, you know, someone in computer vision doesn't understand how a gene regulatory network works in a plant, right? Why would they? Because that's not their expertise. So asking them to do that is ridiculous. And so I don't see why we should be asking plant scientists who have spent years understanding the genetics underpinning plant growth to also do AI, right? We're not there yet. It's not so easy to use. And so I think that bridging that gap, it's a skill that you have to learn over many years, actually, and I've got a lot better at it, right? So I think one of the reasons that I have successful collaborations is because I understand that I don't need to know everything about the subject, but I need to know enough that I'm doing good informed science, right? And I'm not leading us down the garden path, to use a British phrase, of somewhere that's not going to end up with anything good. So I think it's unbelievably important. And actually, although the biggest impactful papers are what I would call core computer vision, actually they're all applied on some data sets, right? And so we're really talking about improving algorithms to work on other more niche data sets that perhaps someone hadn't considered was important. Right? And I think that's really, really useful. Your second question was, what was your second question?
I think I just had 2 points. One is the need for you as an AI researcher to know your way in the plant science, and the other one, and the first one was the tremendous power of getting a tool that is very simple in our domain, and this tool can be very powerful in other domain. The only problem is that they are unfamiliar with this tool. You can take, I took the edge detection example. You know, edge detection is a very simple algorithm, yet it can be very powerful when implemented correctly in other domains. Yeah,
and I think it's naive to assume that they will just stumble upon these things themselves, right? And that's not to disparage that area of research. They have other priorities, right? They're busy growing the plants and learning about how they work. This is also true of medical imaging, right? And I think that we as a society move forward more quickly when we work together on things, right? It's a bit like we were talking earlier about, whether large language models can think and how, neuroscientists work in one area of the brain and the AI researchers work in other. Well, if they talked more, maybe we would come up as a society with better answers to these questions, but they never do, right? Or at least they rarely do. And so I think that I'm a big advocate for more collaboration, more interdisciplinary research. The other disciplines have other ways of working, even just the way they run experiments, that are very different to how we run experiments. And you can learn a lot from them, right? And how they do it. I think it's been hugely rewarding for me to do that.
And you're absolutely right. Now, I just went on some of your other papers. Is there like one specific paper or one specific research in in the in the last 2 or 3 years that you find emotionally connected to, or very emotionally connected to? Yes, I will stick with that.
Yeah. So I mean, we have a few papers that we're working on at the moment that are not quite they're not quite ready. They're being submitted. They're getting reviewed, which I think is really interesting. So I can back choose a couple of examples. So the first is that I work with the engineers on improving microscopes, and the idea is that we want to image into the skin to find out, let's say, how deep a melanoma is. Right? Because normally to do that, you would have to cut it out and keep cutting, and you tissue damage, and you know, it's not nice. But the idea would be that you shine a laser light into the skin, it bounces back out, and then you get an image of what's going on, and you can make decisions. Now, in the long term, you can imagine if this was perfected, you could actually do through skin imaging with no harm to anyone, and you could just say, yeah, that's not anything to worry about. That mole is not a cancer. Now, this is an extremely difficult problem because what happens is the light goes into the skin and it comes out completely diffused and refracted around because the skin's got in the way, basically. And so what we're doing is we're working with the engineers who can control the nature of the light going in to try and optimize that process. So the idea is that you shape the light going in so that when it comes out, the image reconstruction is better, right? And this requires...
It will be less diffracted.
Yeah. This requires a strong connection between the AI people doing the predictions and the image reconstruction, and the optics people doing the control of the laser and the deformable mirrors and things like this, right? So it's only possible in a multidisciplinary environment because I just don't know how to do a microscope, right? And they don't do AI, and so it works really, really well. So we have some papers coming out soon on this, which are looking really, really good. Where the idea would be that basically you take an image, you examine it for errors, and you can very quickly send a hardware command to the laser to adapt to capture a better image next time. Right? And the idea would be to do this as quickly as possible so that eventually it can be used in a clinical setting where it needs to happen within a sort of a half a second or something like this. Right? So that's some exciting stuff we're working on. I have another paper that we published recently in CVPR. So we do occasionally get papers in mainstream vision.
Very good, very good.
Yeah. So this was a less applied thing, but it's something that I've become really, really interested in, which is this idea of object saliency. Right? So object saliency is the idea of, if you have a picture, what is the most interesting thing in that picture, right? And it will depend on the person.
What is your metric of interesting?
Exactly, right? This is what's so interesting about it, because you know, if you look at a picture of a completely blank field with a massive elephant in the middle of it, most people would say, well, the elephant's the most interesting thing, right? But why they would say that is not absolutely obvious, right? It's just our kind of gut instinct. And so this is a really interesting area of research where we've got all these metrics that measure saliency and they measure the accuracy of predicted interesting objects versus what a ground truth label says is interesting. But I guess I can't get over the fact that I don't agree with the ground truth labels, right? Because the ground truth labels are captured maybe from a few humans that have gone, well, that looks pretty good, that looks nice. And so we've produced a new data set where we sat a bunch of people down in front of 8,000 images, and we showed people images for only 2 seconds each. Right, so we flashed up an image and we tracked their gaze, and we said, "You've got 2 seconds to look at this image. Just look at it, see what you like, see what you don't like." And so you don't have time really when an image is up for that little amount of time to make decisions as to whether this is more interesting than this. Your gut reaction is just look over here, and we can capture that gaze and we can average it over participants and kind of try and build up a picture of what's useful and what's not. Now, this is still a subjective process, but over a number of participants, you find that some of the objects tend to be looked at more frequently than other objects, and you can slowly kind of build a little bit of a pattern. But I think what's really interesting about this is this work is really just the start. You know, this is a new data set that says if you average the gaze tracking of humans, you can start to pick out what makes for an interesting object. But it's a limited data set, and I think that in the long term, much better study and dare I say, much better collaboration between computer vision and psychology about what actually is saliency is the way to go, right? I don't think that us in computer vision just working on some ground truth that I curated is necessarily the correct solution. I think we need to use this, work with the psychologists, because psychologists would have, I mean, they do eye tracking studies all the time, and they have much more rigorous ways of doing it than we would in the computer vision literature. And so I think that it's really important to do more study in this area. The idea in the long term would be that you might have, let's say, a smart foreground subtraction, which can pick out what's interesting before making a decision, or a mechanism to crop an image down to a region of interest, or something that goes into a network when describing a scene where it can focus on the most pertinent aspects of that scene, things like this, right? So it could be used as a pre-processing step, saliency, to a bunch of other downstream tasks, I guess is the idea.
I want to say two things. One, the idea of inspecting the gaze using a gaze detection, which brings me to much more objective measure of interesting, is very useful. Okay, and again, this is what we try to do in the computer science. I don't want to give you questionnaires. Just I want to look at your gaze. And the other thing, I had Richard Nisbet on the show, and one of his books is The Geography of Thoughts. And the idea is that Western and Asians treat the world differently. And one of the things that he showed a picture of a tiger in the savannah, and Westerns, when asked what's in the picture, said a tiger, and Asians said a tiger in the savannah. So the idea of the object versus the background is much more profound in Western thought, in Western culture. Yep. So it might be interesting, to distinguish between Asian and Westerns in the gaze detection, but maybe your gaze experiment can bypass this idea of culture.
I think it can, but I also think it's a useful, what you said is exactly right, and it's a useful further study, right? Maybe averaging gaze over participants dampens down the effect of biases and cultural influence, but maybe we actually don't want to dampen those things down. Maybe we want to accentuate those things and find out those interesting differences, right? Because you could imagine that in some societies, a certain AI that's trained to look at the interesting things that they tend to think are important is more useful than a general one. And, this idea that people might disagree over what's interesting. So we had a participant who commented when they were looking at these things, but they tended not to look at the animals because they don't like animals, which I thought was really interesting. They're just not into it, right? And so that person would gravitate towards the humans and the other, artificial objects more quickly. And so I think it's really interesting that the people disagree. And so maybe in the long term, the better option is to have this nuance embedded in. So the network might say, well, actually, I think both of these things are interesting, but people from this culture would typically pick the thing on the left, and people on the other culture might pick the thing on the right. That kind of nuance, we're not there yet, because obviously we don't have the data sets and the techniques to back this up. But I think that would be really, really exciting if we could do things like that.
I think one question is the role of culture. Is culture a software or a hardware? And in your experiment, when you only get 2 seconds, you look at the hardware or even at the firmware. But after 2 seconds, you get the software thing. And one question is, can or is culture be not only in the software, but also in hardware? Can culture, affect how you wired into looking at things in the 2 second frame?
Yeah, exactly. I think that it would be really interesting because you're right. It could be that. I mean, I suppose a sort of simpler way of putting it might be, subconscious versus conscious, right? So when I look at a scene for 2 seconds, I'm basically doing an instinctual reaction to look at what's presented in front of me. There's no real thought process as we would understand it going on. But after I've looked for maybe 5 or 10 seconds, I've started to understand the scene. I've started to decide, well, actually, I quite like that object over there because it's my favorite color, or it's an interesting flag of a country I don't recognize, and I'm going to look at that some more. And I've started to bring the rest of my brain in. And you're absolutely right. I don't know to what extent culture plays a role in both of those processes, I would say that this is exactly the kind of time where a computer vision person should reach out to a psychologist for that answer, rather than create a new data set and stick it into a vision conference.
And like Gary Marcus always says, don't be too cocky, AI guy. Please consult other disciplines as well. This is very important. We don't have all the truth, all the wisdom within our community. And the AI community must consult other fields of expertise.
There is a big trend, and it's the same thing that makes people focus on short-term wins in terms of publications rather than long-term hard, difficult science. Is that AI is seen as kind of better than other things, and we should all focus on this, and to the detriment of everything else. And that is completely incorrect as far as I can tell. You know, my opinion is that if your AI takes a little bit longer, but you're bringing other people along and you're better informing your eventual goals, that's much, much better science. And I think I would encourage everyone to do this. You know,
you're absolutely right.
There's loads of people working on general problems, right? You don't need to do that. I hope also as a sort of academic community, we stop over rewarding that side of things, right? You know, because things like CVPR papers are seen as a really big deal, and they are, right? It's a competitive conference, but ultimately most of the papers in CVPR won't be that interesting in a year's time because of the nature of how they're written and what they do. Whereas there are papers that, let's say, would combine computer science with engineering or computer science with psychology that could be landmark papers for many years. And, you know, those are the ones to aim for.
Definitely. And again, if you come up with the next architecture like transformers, this is great. Okay. But, you know, many people find their creativity and, you know, their unique way to contribute society in the combination of two different fields. Okay. It's much harder to contribute in one single field. It is much more common and in a way much easier to contribute in two fields that you're basically familiar with the two. Yep. Now, I want to ask you one almost last question, because you talked about how to learn AI, how to begin your journey in the AI, and you had many great examples. Again, the TensorFlow and the PyTorch, and I will also incorporate Fast AI, which is a great source of information, and there are great tutorials, and the Andrew Neg Coursera course, which is, I think, just a must go-to course for anyone, and there are great books. I recommend my students, you know, the hands-on machine learning and scikit-learn. This is a great book, but this book, although very, very great, and updated for TensorFlow 2, has no transformers. And the idea is that our field has gone through tremendous progress, and the transformers, Attention Is All You Need, were published in 2017. So the idea is that this is changing to just in a too rapidly way.
Yeah.
And when I conversed with Shai Shalev Schwartz, the CTO of Mobileye, I asked him, what do I need to learn in order to come into this self-driving car industry? And he told me, just math. We will teach you everything. Just focus on the math. We only need you if you know math well. So my question is, how do you see this quote from Shai Shalev Schwartz, which is a very interesting quote, because some of the things that we are doing is math, but machine learning is not glorified statistics.
No, I think I think there's a lot of truth in that, right? I mean, I would maybe broaden the term math and just talk about the kind of theoretical underpinnings of machine learning, right? So yes, there is some linear algebra involved, and it's helpful to know how those things work, because then you have multiple loss functions, you can understand what mathematically that means. I would say that, learning a specific architecture is not hugely useful, right? If you go in and say, well, I don't know how machine learning works, but I did read the transformer paper and I pretty much have that down, that's not going to be sufficient, because who knows when something else is all you need will be released and we will move on from transformers. It moves incredibly rapidly. I find that, so my kind of my kind of approach with students would be to read the seminal papers, but only a bit, right? So for example, read the paper on read Yann LeCun's 99 paper, and then maybe read VGG.
Games of imitation. On my seminar, I showed them seminal papers, and then I had, what is a seminal paper in computer science? And then I lean towards Games of Imitation by Alan Turing. Okay, so what would you consider seminal papers in machine and deep learning?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots. So I suppose I wouldn't want to label them, but what I would say is that they're papers where that approach has seen quite a lot of traction over at least, let's say, 3-4 years, right? Because a paper that comes out and is really interesting for one cycle of CVPR, but the technique is no longer used, is not interesting, right? In the grand scheme of things. So, so for example, the core backbones, so things like residual networks, is very, very important, because ultimately even new techniques tend to put them in. Yes, you can read about transformers and then vision transformers, so you know what they are. Things like RCNN, because sometimes you just need to do some object detection, and that will get you the job done. That and YOLO. I like to contrast RCNN and YOLO because they are two different approaches to the same task. One is a region proposal based approach, and one is a single shot detector, and I find that interesting as a difference. I don't have any particular preference. I just think it's interesting. So I would focus on those, and then for segmentation, maybe UNet, right? Even though UNet somewhat got lucky to be the standard, but it is, and so read it, right? Understand the concept of an encoder and a decoder, because that same principle also occurs in large language models, right? It looks different, but it's still the same thing. So I often get my students to have a little bit of a look at these. But I would also, things like the Coursera course, they're more about teaching you what happens when a loss function does this, and what happens when a loss function does this. And those are actually the more useful skills for me. The skills of, it doesn't work, how do I ferret my way to a solution when the network is outputting absolute nonsense? That, I think, is a useful skill to have. Rather than I know intrinsically how all of these different networks work, which I think you can just read papers and learn when you need to. You see what I mean? So I think that the quote is absolutely correct, that if someone comes in with a good understanding of how machine learning theory works and how you would train a network, you can then train a specific network later and learn your way around that technology.
Wow. I couldn't agree more. And again, the idea of, the Andrew Neg course on Coursera, which again, what do you do when things don't go the way you expected them to go? I think this is exactly how you as a scientist is measured as how good your science is. So first, thank you so much for your time. In my last two questions always is, could you name a book that you read in the last 5 to 10 years that made a huge impact on you?
Yeah, well, I'll name two. For you'll understand why in a minute. So I do have the classic deep learning text, right? I would say that for people who are looking.
Just a second.
Yeah. Right. This is a good book, right? There's no doubt, but this is a good book if you want to learn a lot about the different topics. It obviously is. It is mathematical. But it's all in there, right? What I would not do with this book is read it end to end, right? That's not going to make you happy, right? You want to as you start to learn about different techniques, use this book as a reference to sort of cement that knowledge, right? That's the thing to do. And now a completely different approach, because I happen to teach. So one of the weird things about university that you probably know is that you don't always teach the subject you research, right? Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And I teach cryptography. And this book, Understanding Cryptography, is really, really, really good. And it's really interesting for anyone who's not a cryptographer. If you're just do your day job of AI, but read a book like this and just learn about something completely different, because it's super fascinating, right? And you might also learn a little bit more about how the world works, right? So, for example, I've become convinced that the solution to deepfakes is not just better deepfake detection. It's cryptography, right? It's digital signatures that sign the source of a video so that it cannot be tampered with, right? Those techniques already exist, but the AI people don't know about them, so they don't propose them as solutions, right? So I think,
again, just like the edge detection that the plant people don't know, we as AI people are not familiar with the digital signature. Therefore, we, just strike our heads in the wall trying to do better deep fakes detectors.
Exactly. If you're going to end up, if you're an academic and working in AI, then what you will typically do is just do lots of AI and publish papers on it. And that's being siloed a little bit is okay in that situation. But if you end up working in industry or for a startup, the startup is going to have other jobs to do other than literally training networks. They've got to deploy the system in a safe way. So you need to know about software engineering. You need to know about cryptography. These are things that come up even if you don't work in that area. And so I think that a broad understanding, this is kind of what I do with my videos, right? A broad understanding of different aspects of computer science, I find really, really interesting. And I think it's only going to make you better, even in your own field, just by having an understanding of how other things work.
And thank you. And one very, very last question. I promise you are so productive. You do so many things. Can you just give me one tip or two, if you may, about how to be more productive? In case of, in the context of paper writing, in the context of being a better academic.
So I think that you have to also understand what career stage you're in, right? So when I started as a postdoc, I might have one job, and my job is to do X amount of work and then release a paper at the end of the year or something like that, right? And that was in some sense hard, but it was also in some sense easy because I had that focus. Now, when I have multiple PhD students, I have collaborations across schools and I have collaborations in Europe and America. It's much harder to manage that, and you have to be able to rely on other people to do those things for you. So I actually train many fewer deep networks now than I used to because I don't have the time. I supervise people who train those networks, and so I've got much better at the managing of that process and asking them what worked. Can you show me a table of results? Let's talk about what happened there. And so I think if you're a postdoc, then head down, get those good papers out, fine. As you start to move up through that thing, the way that I'm productive is I try and focus on what I'm good at, which is getting good things out of other people. I don't distract myself by going and training a bunch of LLMs on my own because it's not going to lead to good papers, right? I haven't got the time for that. So I have to be quite selective about what I personally can do. And in a way, it's a shame because I like to program and I like to run these things. But that's not the career stage that I'm at. I'm at a stage where I'm more managerial, and I've just had to accept that and lean into it, I think.
I also have students, and I always come to the question when my expertise was in the deep learning, AI, etc. And this was in my PhD, and we never actually learned how to be managers, how to drive people, how to get the best out of them. So some of the things that we do is just like intuition, but we don't have for me, we don't have the toolbox. I consider myself as my toolbox is missing some important ingredients regarding how to manage my students.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important there, so Nottingham, for example, puts on leadership programs and managing programs that help you skill up in this area. I think different institutions will and won't do this, but I think the broad argument is that this is actually a real subject area that people actually have got quite expert at. I haven't, so I can learn something from them. So there are books, there are books on managing, and there are processes involved. And so to an extent, I've had to learn this as I go, like everyone else. But I think actually there is expertise out there that you can seek out, and that is a good way to help, because I think it is very, very difficult. Actually, it's a skill very, very different to what I would learn during my PhD and my postdoc, which was essentially coding, machine learning, image analysis. Managing people is a very different idea, and and a very different set of skills. And that's something that I found difficult because it is hard, but, you know, I'm hopefully slowly getting better at. But I would, if you recognize it as a different skill that not everyone automatically has just because they're good at research, that's the first step, I think, in trying to find out how to improve yourself in that area.
Guys, training a PhD student and training a neural network is not the same thing. Basically.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
According to Jewish wisdom, if you learn something from someone, you need to call him rabbi. So I learned so much, and I think you are a rabbi of many, many people. So Rabbi Mike Pond, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. It was actually mind-blowing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Okay.